We have a marvelous staff here and great volunteers, wonderful administration, but we haven't been able to function. We're trying to hang on like a lot of nonprofits right now. This lecture is designed to sort of keep things going. The blockade is perhaps the most famous naval subject in the history of the United States. It's very much maritime history, which is what the National Lighthouse Museum is all about. I thought that a series of lectures on the blockade would be something that'll kind of keep the light going this summer. But I think it's a good cause, and we certainly will appreciate if you participate with this program. We're ready for part 2, the Union blockade, and we're going to cover 1862. And I know it seemed there was an awful lot that took place in 1861, and you may have been thinking, hey, when is Wade going to talk about the Monitor and the Merrimack? That's what people seem to know when they think about the Union blockade and the role that the Monitor and the Merrimack play. But we're now in 1862, and the first person that we're going to discuss is the Swedish inventor John Ericsson. Now, Ericsson was an extraordinary person, and his accomplishments at a very young age are worth noting. So we have, he entered the Corps of Engineers at the age of 12 in Sweden. Count Platt, the genius of Ericsson came to the attention of a Count Platt who authorized or basically sponsored him to enter the equivalent of the Corps of Engineers in Sweden, age 12. At the age of 14, and this reminds me a little bit of Alexander Hamilton, who was telling ship captains what to do at the age of 14 when he was down in living in the Caribbean. At the age of 14, John Ericsson was in charge of 600 soldiers. In 1836, he invented and patented the screw propeller. Now, that was a revolutionary design which made ships go faster, and ships were able to handle difficult weather much more effectively as a result of this very important invention. He came to the United States in 1839, and he approached the Navy and designed the frigate USS Princeton, which we saw before. The Princeton was a magnificent ship. It had iron cladding. It had these 2 guns. The Peacemaker, which blew up, was not his gun, and the Oregon, which was his gun. But after that disaster took place, Stockton, Robert Stockton, really blamed, he was a devilish character, he blamed Ericsson for what had happened. And Ericsson did not deserve the blame. So for 17 years, he pretty much kept a distance from the U.S. Navy. But now that the Civil War had commenced and the Anaconda Plan was initiated by General Scott, and it was clear that a blockade was going to be taking place, and we see that there's a need now for new and improved ships. Necessity is the mother of invention, and this lag in U.S. naval development that will take place between 1844 and 1862 will end with John Ericsson and his contributions. We have a model of the Monitor here. He brought a scale model of the Monitor to Navy Secretary Gideon Welles and to Secretary of War Stanton and Abraham Lincoln. And the Monitor was 179 feet in length. Its beam was 41 feet 6 inches. It had a crew of 49 officers and enlisted men. It would be commanded by Lieutenant John L. Worden, and it had a revolving turret that was designed by Theodore Timby. Now, Theodore Timby is not one of these people that often pops up in historical reference when we're talking about Erickson. Timby has been given, his name has been obscured in history. Erickson certainly has gotten a lot of credit. Now, one of the points I'd like to really emphasize here is Lincoln was one of those people that encouraged people of merit to contribute as much as possible to the Union cause. We don't have time to even scratch the surface of Abraham Lincoln, and we really can't within the scope of this presentation. But I think it's of critical importance to understand that Lincoln had a very open mind. He was a man, not only a lawyer, but a man of business. He did a lot of work with railroads. He had a very Whig orientation towards the United States. And by that it means belief in strong infrastructure, a belief in progress, a belief in having a powerful manufacturing economy. You know, at a time where people are wondering about 25% customs duties to goods coming in from China, Lincoln had a 48% tariff, which enormously helped the Union manufacturing. In any event, Lincoln had an open mind. The reasons for this, he's a man of the prairie. He's witnessed the tremendous energy that is evident along the Mississippi River. He's traveled as a teenager. He's traveled down the Mississippi. He knows the country well. He believes in nurturing people who are smart, who deserve to be nurtured. And even though, you know, there was something of a deep state that existed in Washington at the time that Lincoln took power. And there were a lot of political hacks who were really creepy people who just expected that regardless of how incompetent they were going to be, they deserved to be the general of an army or to have a very privileged place in the government. Lincoln did his very best to get people of talent into his government. He wasn't always successful. He had to play the game. But for the most part, Lincoln gets a lot of people of talent into the government. And so Lincoln is going to attend a presentation made by Erickson about the Monitor. And there's a few quotes here. After Erickson makes a very convincing presentation. Erickson is very wise now to the Navy. Gideon Welles has explained to Lincoln that it wasn't the fault of Erickson back in 1844 that gun, the Peacemaker, exploded. It wasn't even built by him. So don't blame that on Erickson. And so again, Lincoln is getting good intelligence from an intelligent person, Gideon Welles. And Welles wants Lincoln to see Erickson's presentation. So with his classic humor, after he sees this presentation, he says, all I can say is what the girl said when she put her foot in the stocking. It strikes me there's something in it. And so he's already favorably disposed to Erickson's invention. And then he makes a comment. He says, unassuming son of Sweden, isn't he? Erickson was a bit on the haughty side. After all, he had joined the Corps of Engineers at the age of 12. So this was a man who was used to deference, and he certainly could be a bit arrogant and rub people the wrong way. And Lincoln would later say, I'm sure the Monitor there was some question about whether or not the Monitor, after it had been launched from Brooklyn, on its way to Hampton Roads to meet with the Merrimack, whether it was still floating. And he said, I'm sure the Monitor is still afloat. I look for her to be the venerable sling with a stone that smites the Merrimack Philistine in the forehead. So again, you see the open mind of Lincoln, open to new inventions, and really very supportive of Erickson. Now again, I can't do this presentation without mentioning Theodore Ruggles Timby, who's generally forgotten in history, but I'd like to give a mention to him. Throughout the 1840s, and this was a little bit part of my thesis way back in the 1970s, Timby kept coming to the U.S. Naval Department. He actually built a model of the Monitor that it was 21 of a turret that was 21 feet, and his invention was the turret. Now, generally, Erickson is given complete credit for that, but Timby had a very important role in building the turret. But there was very little interest, especially after the Princeton disaster, in these newfangled inventions that could explode and kill members of a presidential cabinet like that. So there just wasn't the interest. But Timby lived to a long life. There was a movement in the early 1900s to kind of resurrect his reputation. And he died in Brooklyn in 1909. All right, here we have the famous, the epic battle of Hampton Roads. Now, when we talk about Hampton Roads, we're talking about that body of water, the estuary that is very protected and very important to the Union Navy and to shipping for the state of Virginia. And what's happened? The Merrimack was launched on the 8th of March, and it proceeded to devastate the USS Cumberland and the USS Congress, both of which were sailing ships. It did this with its unbelievable artillery. The fact that the shells coming from the Congress and the Cumberland were just literally bouncing off the Merrimack. And then the Merrimack had a device which the Greeks used extensively during their ancient wars in the sea battles that they fought, and that was a ramming device. That's often forgotten when we look at the Merrimack, but it had a very large ramming device, and as a matter of fact, when it rammed the Cumberland, it actually did some significant damage to the Merrimack because it jammed into the ship and then it couldn't get out. And it was causing all kinds of problems for the ship, but it eventually made its way out. Now, the Monitor is set to sail. There's a lot of nervousness in Washington. Stanton, Secretary of War Stanton, is nervous that this ship's going to come right up the Potomac and start blasting away and wreak havoc on the city of Washington. And so the Monitor, which was built in 100 days in Brooklyn, at the Continental Iron Works in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and launched from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, is going to be, 100 days is an astoundingly small amount of time to build a ship of this complexity. But it will arrive at Hampton Roads on March the 9th and do battle with the Merrimack. It's a 4-hour battle. The Merrimack is very cumbersome, very, very difficult to maneuver. The Monitor is more agile, but not that agile. The Monitor is going to do damage to the Merrimack. There will be some damage done to the Monitor, especially to the turret, but mostly resulting in Lieutenant Worden's temporary blindness during the battle. The Monitor is not able to fire very rapidly. Minutes are going to go by between each blast of the cannon, which are 11-inch Dahlgren guns. in this revolving turret that has actually been designed to rest on a sort of pin that goes up and down rather than on ball bearings that will spin around. It's a very ingenious sort of device. And the battle will be a stalemate. I mean, the Southerners are going to claim victory and the Union claims victory, but all the Monitor had to do was stop the devastation of the Union fleet that was stationed in Hampton Roads. And the Monitor was greatly appreciated, and Erickson was greatly appreciated for accomplishing that goal. The Merrimack was, CSS Virginia, was on its way to destroying the Minnesota when the Monitor came into the picture. And so it does save the blockade taking place in Hampton Roads. And it deserves the tremendous amount of praise that it received from everyone. John Erickson has gained, I think, the recognition that he deserves. He's not a forgotten character. And so we have, for instance, a statue of Erickson in Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. And this was a bronze statue that was designed by Jonathan Scott Hartley, dedicated in 1903. I used to love looking, because I was always into the Monitor as a little boy, and I used to love looking at that statue. And it was sort of at the far end near where Pier A is today. And then at one point a few years ago, it disappeared. And I was absolutely beside myself. What have they done with Erickson's statue? Well, I subsequently found out that a new pedestal was erected. The bronze was cleaned, and it was placed in a new position right at the entry point of Battery Park. So if you cross Bridge Street and then cross the street over to Battery Park, you will see, in a way, Erickson is standing there kind of welcoming people with his model of the Monitor, welcoming people to Battery Park, one of the great parks of New York City. So it's certainly a place of great distinction for Erickson. There's a statue, Monitor Memorial, at Monsignor McGolrick Park in Greenpoint, a statue that's done in a kind of an Art Deco style by Antonio De Filippo in 1938. And this statue honors not only Erickson, but also the crew of the Monitor, 16 of whom perished on the last day of 1862 off of Cape Hatteras as it was on its way to participating in a campaign against Charleston. So the great battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack really was a very important one. I don't think it was at all exaggerated. Its importance was exaggerated. Very soon after the Monitor was built, there were a large number of other Monitors constructed. And in fact, the Monitor became the name of a class of ships that would be developed by the Union. And pretty much, I guess an analogy would be the British dreadnoughts. That was a class of ship for a big battleship. So there was a class of Monitors, and they were built in rapid succession. And they would patrol not only the coastal ports along the Atlantic, but also rivers. So now we have a battle that, two battles that I think are of great importance to mention here for a whole number of reasons in 1862. 1862, we find that Lincoln is certainly very, very gratified by what happened with the Monitor, but there is bad news elsewhere on the military front. And about the only good news that he gets is the capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson Now, Ulysses S. Grant, of course, he's a military man, and we're focusing on the blockade. But we can't talk about the blockade without talking about Grant for this reason. Grant is going to be very supportive of the Navy. He's going to have a very good and workable relationship with David Dixon Porter, who's going to provide naval support for him in the conquest of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and in the famous conquest of Vicksburg. So Grant had a very difficult time in his career. He did have a drinking problem. His problem was alcoholism, and the recent book by Ron Chernow entitled Grant is very good on this subject, because he discusses Grant's alcoholic problem, but it was never a problem that interfered with his military ability on the field. It was usually after a battle, but he had a physical condition that I guess required alcohol. And but his condition was probably not as bad as the press often made it out to be, because the press had a field day with him. Now because of his drinking, he retired as an Army officer. He had served with some distinction in the Mexican campaign. His career after he retired from the Army was a series of disappointments. He went into a dry goods business, a leather tanning business in Galena, Illinois, working with his father, who was a bit of a scoundrel. He went in real estate. He was not good in business. He was very frustrated. And at the age of 40, 41, his career seemed to be going nowhere, and he was terribly frustrated. Now, while Grant may not have graduated first in his class, in fact, he was far from it, from West Point, there are some things about Grant you should know. For one, Grant was very gifted mathematically, and that's something I've always admired, because my mathematical abilities are so mediocre. And people who know math well, his mathematical skills, he actually taught math at West Point, and he had a kind of a photographic memory. He was a very excellent artist, and he remembered the topography in a way that was almost like taking a photo. So if you combine his mathematical skills with his photographic memory, ability to understand landscape and remember it, you have some very good qualities. In addition, Grant is, in many ways, he's a very decent, humble, but unbelievably superb commander of men. Men, once they got to see him and experience his type of leadership, really took to him, because he was unassuming. There was nothing false or pretentious about him. He was a regular guy with extraordinary abilities. Now, I mentioned to you before that Lincoln liked to bring on people who had talent. And Lincoln's hearing some pretty good things about Ulysses S. Grant in Washington. He's getting reports back. Elihu Washburn, who actually represents the Galena district in Illinois, Washburn is going to become his champion. And he's going to filter a lot of the reports over to Lincoln in very glowing terms. Washburn and Grant had established a good relationship. It was a wonderful political relationship for Grant. So these important battles, such as Henry and Donelson, are going to really capture the imagination of Lincoln, who understands that control of Kentucky is of the utmost importance for the Union. Now, Lincoln believed that as a border state, Kentucky had to be controlled. Kentucky is going to lie on the border with the Ohio Valley, and it's in the middle. If you allow the Confederates to control Kentucky, then they can control the Ohio Valley. And if they control the Ohio Valley, they'll have complete access via the Ohio River into the Mississippi River. So there's a whole system of rivers that we need to know if you're going to have a reasonable understanding of the importance of Fort Donelson and Fort Henry's capture. So I have here, well, you see they're only about 10 miles apart. And Fort Henry, which is on your left, is right near a body of water called the Lakes of Kentucky. And that's going to lead into the Cumberland River, which is going to lead into Paducah. And Paducah is a major port city for the state of Kentucky, through which you find the Tennessee River, the Cumberland River, and the Ohio River all flowing in together. And then, as I said, the Ohio River will flow into the Mississippi. So if you're going to control Kentucky, you absolutely must control the major rivers, and certainly Paducah is a very important city. And Grant made a proclamation in Paducah. He went to Paducah and observed a great deal of secessionist activity, and he was very much troubled by what he saw. He issued a proclamation that was so beautifully worded, talking about the importance of Union control being established so that sovereignty of Kentucky can remain under Union control. And it was such a balanced and well-crafted proclamation that once Lincoln read it, he was very, very impressed. And as I said before, Lincoln kept hearing nothing but good news about Grant. All the other generals, I mean, George Britton McClellan was a disaster. McClellan was a constant complainer. All of the generals that were leading the Army of the Potomac were bellyachers and always blaming their faults on somebody else. Grant never blamed anybody for anything except himself, and he was a man of action. Lincoln said, "The man fights." So we have here a map showing you the Tennessee River, which cuts through both Tennessee and which is also considered a border state. And so the border states that Lincoln had to be very sensitive about if he was going to maintain this delicate balance in his policy. He had to make sure that Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Maryland were going to not oppose the Union, that they would remain neutral. Now, as long as the Union continued to control the Tennessee River, there would be a very good chance that Tennessee would remain, at the very least, neutral. Now, that policy was so important, it precisely explains to us why Andrew Johnson is going to be selected as his vice presidential candidate in 1864, because Johnson served as governor of Tennessee and helped to keep Tennessee out of the war. So Tennessee and Kentucky are of the greatest importance. Now, here we have a map showing the Kentucky Lake, and you can drive between Fort Donelson, which is on the right to the east. It's only a 17-minute drive between Donelson and Henry. And Donelson itself, by controlling Donelson, it puts you in a very good position to control the city of Nashville, one of the major cities of Tennessee at that time, and certainly today as well. There's so much to mention about Grant's campaign. And unfortunately, we have to kind of move it forward here. You've no doubt heard of the famous Battle of Shiloh, or the Pittsburgh Landing. The Southerners called it Shiloh, the Union called it Pittsburgh Landing. Shiloh was, at that time, this is a Currier and Ives print, and it shows the two-day conflict up to that time, April 7th and April 8th, the bloodiest battle in American history up to that time, with over 23,000 dead and wounded. It was surpassed by Gettysburg a year later, which had 47,000 deaths and casualties. General Grant received a lot of criticism for that battle. He, in fact, won the battle. The two-day campaign, the first day, the Confederates got the upper hand, and the second day, the Union stiffened resistance. Support that Grant was supposed to receive. For instance, one army that was led by Lew Wallace, the man who wrote Ben-Hur later in the century. Lew Wallace totally failed him at Shiloh. He was supposed to bring in the army. He took a roundabout route, didn't arrive in time. But in spite of all of that, suffice it to say here, Shiloh turns out to be a victory, but that's not what the press said. The press, I guess the sort of the fake news of the time, constantly twisted and lied about what actually happened in Shiloh, there was a Whitlaw Reid who wrote this absolutely false account of what happened, and always poor Grant was getting blamed for his drinking, for his alcohol, and they would put him in a very negative light, talk about his drinking, and how could this man possibly lead Union armies. But Lincoln always believed in Grant, and when Lincoln mentioned to a group of his cabinet members, they were saying, yeah, he drinks whiskey. He said, I wish you could tell me the type of whiskey that Grant drinks, because I'd like to send a barrel to the rest of our generals. So Lincoln always had this sense of humor. He said, the man fights. The man sends me great reports. And so Lincoln always believed in Grant, and Grant never let him down. The two would develop a very, very close relationship. When Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th of 1865, Grant visibly wept and was devastated. And the two of them looked at the world in much the same way. Both prairie men, both men of progress, both had a genuine aversion to slavery. It took Grant a little bit longer to develop that, but his antipathy towards slavery was very, very genuine. And now, after the disastrous Battle of Shiloh, and his army is able to survive, well, that's going to be the same army that's going to head further west to Vicksburg. Now we see here there's a map of Corinth, which is in Mississippi, just at the very northern boundary of Mississippi, and it was the site of quite a few important railways, which is precisely why the Union wanted to make sure it was under their control. Corinth, Mississippi was the town where the Mobile and Ohio Railroad linked Alabama to the Ohio River and intersected the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, an important supply line connecting the Mississippi River at Memphis, Tennessee, all the way to Richmond, Virginia. So all of that could be cut out if you gain control of Corinth. Now, as it turns out, Corinth was pretty much evacuated by Confederate troops. And the reason for that is they were seeking to reinforce positions in Vicksburg, which is of even greater importance than Corinth. And General Henry Halleck, who was a little bit of a pain in the neck, to say the least, for General Grant, Halleck was one of those types of commanders who really didn't understand how to move on a field of battle, very much like George McClellan. He knew his history. He could talk about battles in a very educated way, and yet when it came to actually fighting, he never moved. And Grant really didn't respect him, and Halleck was standing in the way of Grant's progress. It's a very complicated situation, but I'll just say that when the smoke is clear on the difficulties that Grant is having with Halleck and with his career at a certain point, President Lincoln and Elihu Washburn, his congressman from Illinois, are going to make it possible for Grant to take control over a very large area of this region, with the idea that he will initiate the invasion of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is in many ways the most important target for the Union during the Civil War. And I want to read a statement attributed to Abraham Lincoln. This was a conversation that was reported by David Dixon Porter about Vicksburg. And Porter, who we met before, was the commander of the fleet that gave Grant absolutely crucial support during the Battle of Vicksburg, and he had a number of victories along the coast as well. So Lincoln said, see what a lot of land these fellows hold, meaning the Confederates, all of which Vicksburg is the key. Here is the Red River, which will supply the Confederates with cattle and corn to feed their armies. There are the Arkansas and White River rivers, which provide cattle and hogs by the thousands. From Vicksburg, these can be supplied all over the Confederacy. Then there's that great deposit of supplies on the Yazoo River. Let us get Vicksburg, and all this country is ours. The war can never be brought to an end until that key is put in our pocket. I am acquainted with that region, and I know what I'm talking about here. Valuable as New Orleans will be to us, Vicksburg will be more so. We may take all of the ports, and they will defy us from Vicksburg. It means hogs and hominy grits without limits, and it means cotton where they can raise the staple without interference. Now, Grant was in complete agreement with Lincoln about Vicksburg because Grant, who was born in Ohio and who lived in and around the Mississippi area, he knew the importance of Vicksburg because Vicksburg commands these tremendous bluffs that overlook the river. And if you can control those bluffs, you can control the river. So Corinth, this occupation of Corinth, which is certainly going to help the Union, is going to be a step along the way heading westward towards Vicksburg. We have a map here of the Mississippi River, and just look at all the different tributaries. Look at all the rivers. That's one of the things that Lincoln always talked about. You have bayous, and you have rivers, and you have streams. You have every imaginable type of body of water. So when we're talking about the blockade, it's natural that we would think of the blockade in terms of the Atlantic Ocean. But we also need to think about the blockade in terms of these bodies of water which connected. They provide the arterial veins of the United States. The blood flows through these veins and gives life to the Confederacy. If you cut off these veins, if you block them, the patient dies, so to speak. And so whether it's the Mississippi River, the Arkansas River, or the Red River, the Tennessee River, which we mentioned before, the Ohio River, there are certain junctures where these rivers can be stopped and brought under control by the Union. And so this is going to become one of the most important objects for General Grant, who is going to be given this magnificent opportunity to take Vicksburg. Now, remember we're in 1862, and during 1862, in fact, even before that, we had the conquest of New Orleans. And I want to say something about New Orleans so you can put that into perspective as well. Now, the city of New Orleans, while not as important as a military target as Vicksburg, was still very important. And I'd like to say a few things about New Orleans to put this into context. And as with the city of Mobile, New Orleans traces its development by the French before it was acquired as a result of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. In the 19th century, New Orleans was the largest port of the South, exporting a vast amount of the nation's cotton and a wide range of other products to Western Europe and New England. As the largest and most important southern city, it became a critical target for capture by the Union. Two enormous estuaries that are commonly referred to as lakes, Pontchartrain and Maurepas, contain, along with the mouth of the Mississippi, some of America's great fishing beds. At the end of the 18th century, the sugar processing industry was placed on a firm foundation with sugar cane derived from the islands in the Caribbean. Its location at the mouth of the Mississippi gave the city accessibility to all of the agriculture produced by states adjoining the Mississippi River. The tremendous importance of New Orleans' economy and power made it a target of the British during the War of 1812, when its extraordinarily heterogeneous population, under the command of General Andrew Jackson, roundly defeated a British invasion force. Privateers such as Jean Lafitte were recruited for the Great Battle. Large numbers of German and Irish immigrants in the 1840s helped New Orleans become the wealthiest and third most populous city in America. The introduction of natural gas, the Pontchartrain Railroad, and the location of the U.S. Mint highlighted its powerful economy. New Orleans was captured without fighting inside the city. It was captured by the Navy. And what we have here is an area called the Head of Passes. That's where the main stem of the Mississippi branches off into three distinct directions at its mouth in the Gulf of Mexico. This made entry into New Orleans very complicated. And in fact, the first major effort that was made to get into New Orleans was going to be stopped by what the Confederates referred to as their Mosquito Fleet. Mosquito Fleet was really a fleet of a number of rafts that were lit on fire, and some gunboats, but nothing of great substance. The very first effort to get into New Orleans would be stymied by the Head of the Passes and the Mosquito Fleet. But then the next effort to get into New Orleans would be successful. We have the Battle of New Orleans taking place on April 25th to May 1st, 1862. This print shows the tremendous vitality of of the New Orleans port, and its wealth was tremendous. The Battle of New Orleans was going to be a ferocious one, but one that was a good deal easier for Admiral Porter and Ben Butler than they at first imagined, because there had been, during the Battle of Shiloh, a great many of the army that had occupied the area around New Orleans had rushed off to help in the defense. And so the city itself was relatively undefended, except by two forts and on the Mississippi, and that was Fort Jackson and Fort Phillip. Fort Phillip you see on the right, and Fort Jackson on the left. Once you could get past those forts, which the Union fleet managed to do, then New Orleans was there for the taking. Now, I suppose you could say this man was certainly controversial, very colorful, a man who played a great role in my life as my professor and supervisor when I was at Brooklyn College. Hans Louis Trefus was an expert and wrote about 20 books on the Civil War. One of the books that he wrote was on Ben Butler. Ben Butler, the South called him Beast. Now, Ben Butler was a political character. He was one of these people that one could definitely call something of a hack, who managed to insinuate himself into the right circles, and he was known to be fairly corrupt. He had some good aspects, but he becomes one of the most unpopular figures in the history of the Confederacy. Butler takes command of the city of New Orleans in 1862, and he was extremely unpopular with the residents of New Orleans. And just to give you an idea about how people viewed Butler, one Southern officer commented that when Butler smiled, it was like the breaking up of a hard winter. But an even funnier quote, call before you a mental vision of a sack of muck, and then imagine 4 enormous German sausages fixed to the extremities in lieu of arms and legs. And there you have Ben Butler. Jefferson Davis issued a proclamation that any Confederate officer who collared Butler would be entitled to hang him post haste. Now, why was he so unpopular? This was a circular, I'm sorry, that's the next one. This was a circular, order number 28, that Ben Butler issued primarily to the ladies of New Orleans. The ladies of New Orleans were not happy that Union officers and Union soldiers were occupying their city, and they did everything they possibly could to make them uncomfortable. They threw chamber pots out of the window. As a matter of fact, Admiral Farragut, who participated in the invasion of the fleet's invasion of New Orleans, was the victim of one such chamber pot. So these kinds of attacks, they'd be spit on, they'd be cursed, everything unpleasant, often to the officers, but also to the regular soldiers. So Butler got so fed up, he issued this order number 28, and it reads as follows. As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subjected to repeated insults from the women calling themselves ladies of New Orleans in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter when any female shall by word, gesture, or movement insult or show contempt for any officer or private of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her vocation. Now, these are, it's very devious, this statement, and basically he's telling the ladies of New Orleans that you're a whore if you do this, and you will be treated as such. And of course, whores were arrested and put into prison. Well, I have to say that this proclamation worked, because the women stopped their behavior and the soldiers were being treated much more respectfully after that. But you can understand why a circular of this kind would be terribly insulting to Southern people. Now, there are things that he did which we can look in a very positive light. So that, for instance, the slaves that were captured during the war would have a very funny, strange status, because before the Emancipation Proclamation, people could still legally regard slaves as a person's property. And the Emancipation Proclamation was going to declare that slaves that were in the states that were seceding and making war against the Union, that those slaves would be freed. The slaves in the border states were not going to be freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. That would await the 13th Amendment. It's a very delicate game that Lincoln is skillfully playing. Butler is going to provide language and a policy that will fit into the eventual adoption of the Emancipation Proclamation. And that is that slaves are henceforth, captured slaves, will be regarded as contraband of war. And that basically means that now it's the option of the Union to deprive these slaves. They're not the property of anyone anymore. They're now contraband of war, and this can provide the precondition for them to be free. So, we can say that Butler had some decent aspects. In terms of his administration of New Orleans, he provided for very good sanitation, pretty decent law and order, and he seems to have done a fairly good job. But Butler always got himself in trouble. People didn't like him for very clear reasons. He was an odious character, and people could see it, and he was corrupt. One of his nicknames were Spoons Butler, because one time he stopped a woman and confiscated her silverware. And people don't know exactly whatever happened to that silverware. And he got the term Spoons Butler came out of that. People had a very good feeling that he was doing a lot of very corrupt things in New Orleans and making a good deal of money from the whole operation. And of course, that made him an embarrassment for Lincoln. But this was a guy you didn't want to cross because he was a bad enemy. So he was one of those people that you had to kind of tolerate. Later on, at the end of the war, when he totally fails Grant is going to get permission from Lincoln and Stanton to finally fire Butler. And Grant had no particular regard for any of his military abilities. He thought they were nil. And so, but Butler will go on. He'll eventually become governor of Massachusetts. He'll run for the presidency in 1884. And I guess he'll go down in history, the best way to describe him, as extremely controversial. Now, we mentioned the Alabama. And while all this is taking place in New Orleans, and the United States has consolidated control over New Orleans, it has not yet taken Mobile, Alabama. And remember, Mobile is to the east of New Orleans. So you'd say, well, why didn't they get Mobile? Well, that's because Mobile had two very formidable forts, Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan, that the Union was not quite ready to attack. So the Confederacy is still operating some of its commerce raiders, etc., out of Mobile. Now, one of the great heroes of Mobile is going to be the person that we met before, Raphael Semmes, Confederate naval hero, Rear Admiral, and this is a bronze statue that remains today in Mobile. That statue is still in Mobile, and the sculptor Caspar Buberl fashioned this beautiful statue that honors this commerce raiding activity that allowed the Union allowed the Confederacy to survive. One of the ships that he captained was the SS Sumter, along with the Alabama. And this was converted from an 1858 merchant steamer, originally called the SS Havana, and it was the first steam cruiser in the Confederate Navy. It operated between July and December 19th, 1861. It destroyed 18 ships of the Union fleet and the merchant fleet. Eventually, it was defeated at Gibraltar in the Mediterranean. We have it's a good photograph showing the dashing nature of Semmes. He looks a little bit like Rhett Butler here, I think. A little bit on the swarthy side and very, very dashing. And so in this picture, we see the ultimate fate of the CSS Alabama, defeated by the USS Kearsarge at the port of Cherbourg in France on the 19th of June, 1864. And it was commanded by Captain John A. Winslow, who became something of a hero for the United States. And as a matter of fact, at his funeral, his coffin was draped by the flag of the USS Kearsarge. So it was a tremendous event for the United States to finally get this devilish ship, the Alabama, which had destroyed 65 vessels.